Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters. And today I'm joined by Shelley, who is a home educator and also an expert in auditory processing disorder and British Sign Language. I feel like I need a medal for managing to get all those words out in the right order and in the right pronunciation. So yay, me. So first of all, Shelley, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And do tell us a little bit about your home education journey.
Thank you so much for welcoming me along here today, Eleanor. And yes, well done for getting all the words out. So our home education journey actually started very, very shortly after the birth of my second daughter. I have 12 and a half months between my two oldest children, and it actually meant that I didn't go back to work. And so it gave us an opportunity to explore other ways. And I first initially got interested in home education when I think my youngest daughter was about 2. And my eldest daughter is 18 this year. My youngest daughter is 17 this year. And at the time, I don't know if you remember, Eleanor, it was all in Yahoo groups. Facebook didn't exist. We didn't have the communities. It was like a secret. Nobody knew much about home education. And I learned and discovered and researched, and I found actually that this was something that I would like to pursue. My other half had not had a particularly great time at school. I was bullied myself at school. And because our girls were so close together, it felt like an opportunity that we could explore. And so we did. And I was really fortunate in my area. There were lots of other people with similar age children who knew that they weren't going to do school. And so we set up a little preschool meeting. And there were 6 or 8 of us at the time, and we used to meet really regularly. And that was just like a wonderful introduction. And I have to say that, yes, it is hard. Yes, we have had to do things that we wouldn't necessarily have thought that we would have to do, but I would do it all over again in a heartbeat.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And it was funny you were saying about when everything was on Yahoo, because when I started, I was also based near you around Oxfordshire way. And I joined the Yahoo group, and the very first meetup I ever went to was in this very secret wood in Oxfordshire that you needed like a permit to get into, but one of the other home educating mothers had a permit. And so there was a group of about 6 or 7 of us met in this extremely ancient oak woodland in Oxfordshire where you couldn't get into. And it was like a secret club. It was like I'd entered like a little witch's coven in the nicest possible way, secret club. So I know exactly what you meant. Back when we started, it was this very niche little hidden thing,
very
wasn't it?
Niche. Yeah. Yeah, and sort of even talking to other parents about it, and still now to this day, I think post-pandemic things have changed slightly. But they'd ask what year your child was at school, and you say, "Oh, we home educate," and then you would get many reasons why they couldn't home educate.
That's right. That's exactly the response.
I wasn't commenting on your choice. You've made the right choice for you. But yes, and so I think it still is a little bit taboo, isn't
That is it. You're exactly right, because that is exactly the response that I've always had, which is that I say I home educate, and as far as I'm concerned, that's job done, conversation over. And then I could never do that. And I always feel like saying, I don't want you to do that. Like, I'm not telling you should be doing that. And then I get all these reasons why they can never do it. And it's really interesting, isn't it? I can't think of any other occasion of any life choice that you make that instinctively gets the other person saying, oh, I would never do that. Can you imagine if you said, oh, I go running. I really like to go jogging. Oh, I could never do that. Oh no, I hate jogging. I don't like trainers. No, I mean Lycra doesn't suit me. I have nowhere to run around here. I would just get very bored if I was running every day. You'd never get it, would you? But for some reason, when it comes to home education, you always get that kind of all those reasons why they think it's a terrible idea for them.
Definitely. And if I had a penny, I mean, I would be a very rich lady by now. I do wonder if there's something about home education that people fear. I don't know whether that's, you know, sort of a good campaign by the government and local authorities that, you know, we need to be witch hunted. That's another conversation entirely, obviously. Over the years they've tried several times, but, you know, there's a very poor picture painted of people who do home educate. And I think opinions are slowly changing. I would like to see those opinions changing in government, in the NHS. You know, the red flag that immediately goes up whenever you're in a hospital appointment. You know, that your child is home educated, the glances between nurses and doctors, you know, and the quizzing. What's with the quizzing of a home educated child about what they know?
Yeah,
My
yeah.
poor 8-year-old at the time was subjected to the most awful grilling by consultants. And I still, you know, I would have to Google some of the things she was being asked. We
Yeah,
have
it's
to get
like the
very kind
random
to
maths
people now.
questions, and they would ask sort of maths questions. I remember my children, they once said they were learning German, and immediately the person started talking to them in very quick German. And it's like, would you actually do this to a 6-year-old who was in school? Because I think you would just be like, oh, how cute, Kinder or something. But no, you just talk fluently, and then they would look at me as if to say, loser. It's like, no, they just can't understand fluent German yet. That doesn't make me a loser.
Exactly. We're all learning. I mean, I have to say, we've met some very kind people along our way as well. Our lovely GP, who's subsequently left the practice, spent a good 15 minutes explaining to my 7-year-old all about percentiles and was very happy to do so. You know, so we have met some remarkable people along the way who are absolutely lovely, but they tend to be the exception rather than the norm.
That's true, but I think it helps to focus on those positive responses as well,
Yeah,
because it makes us
definitely.
feel that it slants our perception of it slightly more positively, doesn't it? So talk to us about auditory processing disorder in British Sign Language. Is this something that you came to because of personal experience, or is it something that you've sort of found yourself in professionally?
So it's a bit of a combination, actually. And there's a coincidence, serendipity, universal, you know, pushing, who knows? So I was actually made redundant when I was pregnant with my first baby, and I didn't have a job to go back to. And I was very quickly pregnant with my second child, as I mentioned, 12 and a half months between my first two. And so I didn't actually go back to full-time employment. But during my first pregnancy, I discovered about using sign language with young children. So it's called baby signing. And it's essentially enabling little children to communicate using their hands to talk. And it saves a lot of tantrums and tears and misunderstandings. It removes some of the stress of parenting. And so I discovered this because Joseph Garcia, who's the world's leading expert in baby signing, was coming over to the UK. And I was immediately interested because of the person I was becoming, which was a mother myself. And so I retrained. I trained to teach baby signing. And I've always used British Sign Language. And I ran classes around my girls, obviously two with 12 and a half months between them. It's pretty intense, as you can probably imagine. And I developed that as a business, absolutely loved it, taught loads and loads of parents. In between times, we had quite a bad car crash, and my eldest daughter was 11 months old at the time. And there wasn't really any kind of obvious harm done to her at the time. But In later years, and we'd already chosen home education by this point, in later years, we found that she wasn't really responding. She was very sensorily overwhelmed. She appeared to hear, but didn't appear to respond necessarily, needed things repeating. There were lots and lots and lots of things. And so we started, it was actually our lovely nursery nurse, part of the NHS school nursing team, a lovely lady called Nettie, who put us on to, could this possibly be auditory processing disorder, when my eldest daughter was 5. And so we started looking into it. And I have to say, it's really, really difficult. We ended up finally at Great Ormond Street Hospital when she was 9, after a very circuitous route. One of the things about auditory processing disorder is absolutely so comorbid with autistic spectrum condition disorder, that if you have already got an ASC diagnosis, Great Ormond Street and the hospitals will not see you to look at auditory processing disorder because it's assumed that you have it. But she didn't have that diagnosis. So we had to go through speech and language. We had to have auditory tests done at the hospital. She hears perfectly, absolutely perfectly, but she doesn't process. And the best way to explain that, I think, is, have you ever had water in your ears when you've been swimming? Right, so might be one ear, might be both ears, but how annoying is it? You miss the start of words, you miss the end of words, you don't know where sounds are coming from. Some sounds are really amplified, some sounds, it's like you can't hear them. You get cross, you get so cross because you're constantly missing things. My daughter, games moved on, they changed the rules, she didn't know, she couldn't respond quickly enough, she was cross, she was frustrated, she was even self-harming at one point, pulling her hair out, things like that. And so we were quite fortunate because we had had signing on her side since she was a little tiny baby. And at that point, I really, really started concentrating on how sign language helps all children. Obviously has benefits for children who are deaf, but also those children with auditory processing disorder, and how we can all do better together with signing on our side. It's been a very, very long journey, and I've probably skipped over things that you might like to know, so please come back to me.
I feel like I have a lot of questions from that. So auditory processing disorder is when I know absolutely nothing about this. So I'm coming very much from a blank slate. So is it when your hearing is slightly impaired and you only hear fragments of like your hearing pops in and out almost?
No, so it's not actually a hearing disability. It's a processing brain so she hears perfectly, absolutely perfect. There's nothing wrong with her hearing at all. It's all to do with the processing mechanism. And what we still don't know to this day is whether it might be a hereditary condition, which is one of the ways that it can be passed down. Another way is children who have glue ear a lot as young children. And I don't know if you're aware, but the Aylesbury Vale Basin is actually somewhere where glue ear is very, very prevalent. And there are other pockets of it as well, all from trauma. And obviously sustaining the car crash when she was 11 months old, which was a very serious one. We will never know. She's never had glue ear, so it's definitely not that. Could it be hereditary? Again, there's nothing in the family, so we're not sure. So the most likely way that she has ended up with APD, auditory processing disorder, is through trauma.
So it's the connection between the input, the auditory input, and the processing in the brain, the connection misfires.
Yeah. And so she doesn't necessarily understand what is happening around her or what people are saying. But the easiest way to describe it is like you've got, water in your ears, but it never goes away. It's there permanently. And so that's why, part of the reason why I love signing, because signing is obviously visual and it cuts through. So when you're using keyword signs, and again, we've always used British Sign Language. We don't use the grammar structure, which is incredibly, obviously it's completely different to English word order. We just use the keyword signs. But that helps to cut through what she hears with what she sees, and it means she gets the right interpretation.
So do you talk and sign at the same time?
Always talk and sign at the same time. Yeah.
So I know that when I was in my mid-teens, I slightly lost my hearing. Everything became very muffled. I think looking back, it was probably a stress response to exams, but it went on for about 6 months. And I noticed that during that time, I quite liked it because it cut out a lot of extraneous noise and I couldn't hear very much. And I slightly zoned out. Like I would just kind of be a bit in my own world and found myself quite self-contained, and I actually quite liked that. But I can see how over sort of a lifetime that might externalize in the same kind of way as autism. Is that why the two are being linked, or is there an intrinsic link between them?
So I'm not an expert in ASD, and I can't really comment on the comorbidity or why. My daughter has other sensory processing issues as well. So, there's a bigger picture there. You would need to talk to somebody who is more expert about the link between ASD and APD, because it's just outside the realm of my experience. But I do know that, like Great Ormond Street, if there is already a diagnosis of ASD in place, then they will not test for APD.
Because they just assume that you'll have that.
It's assumed that you have that too. Yeah.
So is it a bit like all men are bachelors, all bachelors are men kind of thing? So that if you've got autism, chances are you've got APD, but if you've got APD, you don't necessarily have to have autism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so talk to us then about sign language, because you're right, it does seem serendipitous that you set up this rather beautiful business for baby sign. Now I'm sensing that baby signing and British Sign Language are quite different, or are they not?
Gosh. So baby signing is effectively simplified sign language. Now, there are baby signing companies who use made-up sign language. There are baby signing companies who use Makaton. And there are baby signing companies like mine that use British Sign Language or American Sign Language, whichever is the indigenous sign language. I personally feel it's important to be using a recognised sign language. British Sign Language dates back to the 16th century. It has developed and is remarkable, and it has its own syntax and grammar, and deaf people who sign rely upon it for their initial communication. It's their first language rather than English. And I think if you're going to learn baby signing, it's worth researching and making sure that you are using an organisation that is promoting the sign language of the country in which you're in, because it's such a wider gift to everybody. I sometimes go to the supermarket and there's a deaf cashier there. I always say hello and goodbye and thank you. And he really, really appreciates just that contact of somebody knowing and recognising and seeing him for who he is. And so there's a huge wider context of inclusion, of belonging, of community outside of supporting a disability. There's a whole community out there that relies on it as their first language. And I think it's really important to make sure that we have the correct signs, that we are supporting that indigenous language where possible. because if we don't, what happens? And the BSL bill in the UK is obviously passed. The BSL GCSE is now available. And so I'm really, really really hopeful for the future, actually, that more and more people are going to learn British Sign Language, particularly, but any sign language, in the country that you're in. I'm well aware this is sort of like a worldwide podcast that you have. So yes, it's important. It is important to make sure that you've got these things in place. The National Deaf Children's Society did some research in 2017, and it concluded that 90% of its respondents, both hearing and deaf, would love to learn British Sign Language, but that people don't get the opportunity. And so when we can start off with keyword signing, which is, things like eat and drink, and then we can get more complicated. I've had so many parents through classes and who have loved learning with me and my lovely teachers. They've gone on to be interpreters. They've gone on to be teachers of the deaf. They've gone on to support deaf children in schools. What a remarkable ripple effect is that? It's just brilliant. I love it.
I completely agree. And as an example of of that ripple effect, I learned the alphabet, the sign language alphabet, when I was at school. So A, B, C, D, E. I'm doing it with my fingers, so it's rubbish for a podcast. But basically, I can still remember it now.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is, because it's part of that mechanical memory, isn't it, of doing something with your hands or doing something with your body.
Learning. Yeah, but there's that whole show me. And I remember.
Exactly. I really remember the joy of it. I loved learning it. I loved this sense that I could communicate in a different way that still made sense to everybody. I really loved it. And actually, my children and I, as everybody knows who listens to this podcast, we graduate this year from home education, yippee, in about 6 weeks' time. And our plan for the summer is to resume what we used to do when they were younger, which was summer schools, where they would choose what they wanted to learn. And one of the things that we've all chosen to learn is sign language this summer. And partly that is this ripple effect of me learning when I was 14 and remembering how much I loved it. And now my children are going to learn when they're 16, 17, and it flows in that way. And I think there is something very empowering about being able to communicate in multiplicitous ways to all sorts of people. It's empowering for you, but empowering for society, isn't it?
Most definitely. And I think one of the key things that we forget, 93% of communication is non-verbal. 93%.
Yeah.
It's about how we speak, our body language, how we gesture. And I think people also forget that gesture is a perfectly natural part of any communication. If you have ever watched somebody on the phone, you know, people don't stay still, do they? They march up and down and they wave their hands around. And so, 93% of communication is nonverbal. Gesture is a completely normal part of our communication. And so when we learn something like signing, which is like riding a bike, which you won't forget, going back to the alphabet, once you've got it, it's linking left and right sides of the brain, the creative with the pragmatic. It's something that we do. It's language in motion. And certainly in British Sign Language, I can't comment for other sign languages, but certainly for British Sign Language, signs just make sense. You know what they're trying to convey. You've got like computer and phone and, eat and drink. I mean, people on the podcast can't see, but they are.
But what's interesting is people listening are probably imagining what you're doing. And I would bet that 90% of everybody is right, that you put your hands up to your mouth when you said eat, and you tipped your hand back towards your mouth for drink, because that is, like you say, it's instinctively gestural, isn't it?
It is. And, it's a wonderful thing to learn. And the wider benefits to the deaf community, to children like my daughter who, have really struggled with inclusion their entire life. The ripple effect could be dramatic if we all just took the time even to learn basic need signs, emergency signs. You know, that ripple effect, it touches so many lives. And because signs make sense, I should start a thing called Signs Make Sense, I think. It really does include everybody. I don't know, you know, there's very few people who wouldn't be able to learn to sign and to be able to use it. And it stops distress, it stops meltdown, because everybody knows what is needed or is understood. I mean, even, you know, going into elder care, elders who have had strokes, who can't speak anymore, could you imagine the difference it would make to them? And so there's this whole ripple effect through society whereby signing can help on so many levels. And it's not just about communication, it's about fine motor skill, it's about dexterity, inclusion, belonging, self-esteem, mental health, cortisol load. There's so many things. And certainly for little children, which is, you know, my particular area of expertise, it just helps them make sense of their world and to explain it back to you. And who would want to miss that? You know, you don't want to miss that. Not for
And so to go back to auditory processing disorder, what about something like lip reading, for example? Is that helpful, or is that does that encounter the same connections issues?
So I think it would probably vary. I think if you spoke to lots of different people with APD, then, you know, it would vary in the same way that ASD varies from person to person. So for my daughter, you need to get her attention so that she can turn to you before you start speaking. If you're speaking to the back of her head, she won't know that that's for her. So she needs attention attracting first. So, you know, we always say her name, attract her attention to us. She finds it easier to be facing us, and she will look at our lips rather than, you know, eyes, as well as adding in keyword signs for her. So it is a multi-sensory approach. But interestingly, in the same way that deaf children and adults get incredibly tired from the lip reading and the signing and the concentration levels, children with APD suffer in exactly the same way. It's exhausting. Deaf children with APD, they're working at 200% just to even remotely follow a conversation, let alone being able to join in with it. And this is where sort of a lot of isolation starts taking place. Now, we do know that children of all ages absolutely love learning to sign. And so that is one of the things that can really help. But yes, certainly for my daughter, lip reading is something that she still does now. She does better when things are written down. And I know this is a home education podcast, but for anyone who has children in school who thinks that their child may have APD, or if you're attending, you know, a group session at the museum or something like that, the acoustics are very important in the classroom and any building that you're going in. It's often thought that because it's a hearing disability, you know, people think of it as a hearing disability, even though it's a processing disability, that these children need to be sat right at the front, in the middle, attention firmly on the teacher. But actually, that's not the case. They're better 2 or 3 rows back and off to the side slightly. It will depend on the individual child as to what helps the most. Children with APD struggle with transitions in the same way. Well, I think everybody struggles with an immediate transition. And so strategies like now and next, visual timetables. I know that one of the things that my daughter really struggled with was if something wasn't happening. So as we know, life changes, doesn't it? It changes rapidly. And in home education, meetups can be cancelled because the weather's not quite right. You know, you've planned a beach day and all of a sudden it's just bucketing, all the things. And so what we used to do, if something may or may not be happening because it was dependent on the weather or dependent on somebody else, we had a visual timetable and we'd put it in brackets. And that meant she was prepared for it, but also prepared for it not to happen.
And I think as well that for parents of autistic children, that probably is a really good approach as well, because that kind of ambiguity is very difficult, isn't it? But and the thing is, the world is quite ambiguous, and it does throw up last minute cancellations. And as you say, particularly home education.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, and I know our children are similar age, so we're probably both going through the same kind of scenario, is when it comes to auditory processing disorder and exams, is reading affected? You mentioned that normally reading is okay, but are there access arrangements that you would recommend? Or I mean, I know it must depend very much on the child, but is there does it impact on exams, or is that generally okay? It's them, they got their written paper and it's not too bad?
Again, I think it's going to vary from person to person. My daughter has other things going on, which means that she does need additional access arrangements, things like a scribe. So a reader is not helpful for her, because she then has to listen to somebody else's voice. She actually reads to a really, really high level. And one of the things I was also going to mention is things like subtitles for films and for TV programs. And what I found, certainly with my daughter, and it might not be the same for every child with APD, is that she is an incredibly advanced reader. She does better when things are written down, and her recall is phenomenal, but her working memory is not so good. So there's some real disparities there. Like, she could recite you parts of Tolkien that, I have never read. She can correlate it to the Marvel films. She could, but she wouldn't necessarily remember that she needed to clean her teeth. So the executive function and working memory is really interesting versus her extremely advanced ability to read, which I think is probably born out of necessity due to struggling with oral communication.
And before I ask you a couple of questions I've got about British Sign Language, I wanted to ask you about diagnosis, because it sounds like it might be quite a difficult thing to diagnose. As you were talking, for example, my son has a stammer, and it occurred to me that a lot of the things you were saying about there actually kind of relate as well to him with his stammer. And so that set my brain thinking, like, is his stammer in some ways a kind of connection malfunction between what he's hearing and what he's saying? And then I was thinking, I don't know how I would get auditory processing disorder diagnosed. It sounds like it might be quite difficult to diagnose.
So interestingly, my daughter also had a stammer for many, many years. It would come and go. And it seemed to be roughly every 6 months. It was kind of like it coincided with growth spurts. Very, very interesting. Could never really quite get to grips with whether there was a connection. But I think people who are more experienced than I am would probably be able to comment on that. The route to diagnosis is really, really, it was really, really hard for us at the time. So we actually moved, which helped, ironically. So in the home counties, the services were just rammed. We weren't getting anywhere. We moved to Somerset. And in actual fact, at the time, Somerset this was South Somerset, had an absolutely brilliant sort of all-in-one stop shop service. I could not fault them. They were amazing. I did have to sidestep the consultant, though, because he was an ASD specialist and very blinkered to that. But they did start us on the pathway. They did put us through for occupational therapy, for speech and language therapy. And it was through the speech and language therapist that I got a referral to audiology at the local hospital. Because that came back clear, and because I had been researching, thanks to the nursery nurse here, Nettie, I knew that the next step was then a referral. But I had to sidestep, because in the meantime, we'd been referred to the consultant who really wasn't that interested. So I had to go with the results of audiology from the local hospital to the GP to insist on a referral to Great Ormond Street. It took us all in 5 years from suspecting to diagnosis, and it took us almost, so we were in Somerset for 2 years and she was diagnosed just after we moved back, so 2.5 years, even with that brilliant service that we had from them. So you do have to fight for it, you do. It's not easy, but this was like almost 10 years ago now, well, 1 year ago, so things may have changed. It's still not something, though, that is particularly known about. And I did a post on Auditory Processing Awareness Day earlier in the year, and then I actually shared it into a teaching group that I'm part of. And one of the teachers there was like, I think this is my missing connection for my, a child I have in my class. And like, that's just brilliant. But people don't know. And obviously teachers are expected to know so much anyway. And the NHS, how do you, if nobody's specialising in it, apart from people like Great Ormond Street, how do you know what to push for? How do you know what to push for? And that can be really hard, especially when it's such a difficult thing to navigate. There is still possibly a question mark. Could my daughter be autistic? Possibly. She doesn't really show up in other ways. But there's a further test that she needs called a disco assessment, which is like £3,500.
Something to save up for.
Yes, exactly that. And so in the meantime, she's not necessarily had the support that she had needed. And just coming on to the support side of things, unfortunately, post-diagnosis, there isn't a lot out there to help. It's one of those things whereby certainly here, the NHS SLT was just not interested in support. She's supposed to have weekly intervention once a year, half an hour.
Wow.
Here's some bump.
Yeah.
And in the
so
end,
actually, this very long process of diagnosis, whilst I'm sure it was very empowering to get that sense of, okay, now we know what the issue is, it didn't actually lead to a lot of practical support being offered.
No, and we had to go private in the end, which, we were lucky to find somebody who really understood. I think one of the sort of, I think I've had sort of 2 wobbles really over the years. The first was I was in a big APD group, and they suggested, well, no, they didn't. They came right out and said, no, you should not use signing for children with auditory processing disorder. They need to learn how to get along in the real world. And I was
I hate that response.
Why wouldn't you want the best for your child in any way? And then the other time was, in terms of my signing work, I'm involved in lots of groups there. And someone had posted about an older child with auditory processing disorder who had actually applied for and been accepted to deaf school and was being supported in the deaf school. And I didn't even know that was an option. And I think there's a real education piece needed about how signing supports all children, but particularly children with auditory processing disorder and deafness and autistic spectrum condition, but that also there are options out there that you may not have even considered. And yes, I do home education again in a heartbeat, but part of me at the end of the journey does wonder if we might have done her a disservice.
I think we all think that, Shelley. Honestly, we all think that. I look at my children and I think, my God, maybe I should have put them in school. Like maybe if my son had been in a school, he'd have been bullied out of his stammer. We all think that. I think it's part of home education is we all think, oh my God, what if? Like, have I done it? Because it's such a big choice that we take on our own. And we think it's like a burden. And like not in a bad way, but it's like we take all the responsibility. We are the single point of failure for the choices. And as a result, it leads to these 3 a.m. Oh my God, like, did I get it wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I didn't mean to get upset there. It's just you don't know, do you? It's a huge experiment. It's a huge gamble. And for the most part, I am really happy with how things have turned out. The pandemic was really hard, I think, particularly for home educated children who are used to going to so many different groups and so many different social gatherings and clubs and groups. And I think, for our age children, I think it affected them particularly badly. But for the most part, I have children who are able and willing to learn, who are able and willing to work hard, who have been taught not what to learn, but how to learn, and how to learn for their best advantage. The fact that at the moment one of my children is more interested in volunteering than learning is absolutely fine. She'll get to it when she's ready. She's not ready at the moment. For my eldest, she's really involved with her studies and making plans for her future. But the biggest gift I think we can give our children is this ability to adapt, to thrive within the, I want to say confines, but that's not quite the right word, the confines of their ability, or maybe that should be that, with the expansion of their ability in the way that they learn best. And I will never regret that, but I do wish I'd known that there might have been another option that might have been more suitable for her. Yeah, because it's possible that we might have considered that.
Yeah, but then with that option, you may still have taken the route that you took now, and
Yes.
all you can do is make the choice based on the information that you have at the time, and make the best choice that you can. So when it comes to sign language, you've mentioned British Sign Language. There's also, I know that when my children were little, there was a CBeebies program that had Makaton in.
Yeah.
What's the difference then between Makaton and British Sign Language?
So British Sign, oh gosh. So British Sign Language is a language in its own right. It's actually the fourth Indigenous language for the UK. It was established in the 16th century and is obviously used by the deaf community all over the country, and in places like Kenya, actually, funnily enough, they have a massive BSL use over there, which I was very surprised to learn about. Makaton is a communication system. It is a set number of signs and symbols. It has no grammar or syntax, and it was originally developed for adults with special needs. It consists of the sign, the symbol, and the word. A lot of it is derived from British Sign Language in the first place, which can cause some controversy. And it certainly, it can get quite political in terms of usage. There was a very recent video that has just been round on social media, actually, and it's where the sign for crab is being used, and it's very different in Makaton from British Sign Language, and it means something completely inappropriate in British Sign Language. And so there's been quite a lot of hilarity, but also there's a very serious underlying message there. But things can be misinterpreted, and when you've taken something that's already established and changed it, that there is potential for miscommunication there as well.
Why was Makaton introduced then? If everyone already had a sign language that was working, was it just because it was simpler?
I honestly don't know. It's not my area of expertise. So I believe the original premise was to help adults with special needs, and it was a very prescriptive set of 200 signs, but it is a communication system rather than a signed language.
When it comes to American Sign Language and British Sign Language, just those as examples, is there much crossover? Would you be able to be understood in America if you used British Sign Language?
Probably not. So it's really interesting. So American Sign Language is derived from French Sign Language.
Oh.
However, there are lots of crossovers with British Sign Language, Auslan, and New Zealand Sign Language. But even within British Sign Language, you have regional accents. So in the same way that I might call it a roll here, if you went up to Manchester, it might be a cob or a bap. There are those similar, the similar regional accents in British Sign Language. So one example is a dog. So I use the sign that is my index and middle fingers on both hands, pointing down like a dog would be begging. But in Northern Ireland, my Northern Irish colleague, she slaps the side of her thigh as if you were calling a dog to you. So even within British Sign Language, there are regional differences in the signs that you might use.
What about languages that, as in my mind, have a different language? So French, Spanish, German. I'm guessing because it's visual that not necessarily are there these differences, or is it such that every single country is as different as French language and English languages to us?
I don't have an awful lot of experience of other sign languages. I know that when the sign might not exist in, say, for example, British Sign Language, that we might adopt signs from others. So things like koala and yak, just two that spring to mind. But in terms of how different they are in grammar and structure and how you would use them in other countries, that's I don't know. I don't know, actually. I shall go and find out.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because sign language could be this kind of universal language, which meant that we wouldn't need Duolingo, which frankly, for my own well-being, would be a great thing, because all I hear all around me all the time is ping, 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 ping. So, because everyone in my household is using Duolingo, it's driving me bonkers. We could, because my son is super interested in Esperanto for exactly that reason, because theoretically it was going to be a language that was going to be our common language, but actually it sounds to me like sign language could be that thing, right? Because because it's so visual.
It could. Obviously, the sign language signs and content and how it's used is very much driven by the deaf community. So I think that would be something that they would need to have a huge amount of input into.
Yeah.
There's a lot of history and culture behind sign languages. It's far more than just using your hands to talk. There's a whole cultural thing there that potentially might be lost in every country. It's things like the sign for biscuit is to tap your hand on your elbow, and that comes from when sailors were tapping weevils out of biscuits, out of hardtack on the ships.
Amazing.
And so that I think each country would have that kind of cultural attachment to how signs developed, where they came from, how they were established, and signing therefore could lose some of its richness if we made it universal. I think signs like eat and drink are fairly universal. I don't think anyone in any country anywhere would mistake what that would be. It's just when we get more into this sort of dialect and the culture and the history that I think things could be lost. So it would need to be very, very carefully done in consultation with many, many communities across the world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just as you were saying that, I was thinking that obviously a biscuit comes from the French, I believe, which is twice cooked or something, biscuit. And of course, as part of our language, we absorb all these things from other languages, and Latin roots and Greek roots and Germanic and French and our own cultural things all come in, all become part of our language. So I see exactly what you mean, that sign language is exactly the same. It's just got this huge depth and richness to its context. Okay, so when we're thinking about British Sign Language, I know you mentioned the GCSE, and I'm super excited by this. I think it's a great addition to GCSEs. Do you know much about the British Sign Language GCSE? When is it starting? Do you know? Is it up and running now?
So it's starting next year, as I understand it. I think it's phenomenal. I really, really do. And one of the reasons why I think it's brilliant is because British Sign Language is a modern foreign language. So for children like my daughter, for other children who are unable to access a spoken foreign language, it gives them the opportunity to have that on their, university applications, on their job applications as an alternative, but equally valid and valuable, and possibly even more valuable, the way the world's going. The wonderful thing about sign language is actually it helps you learn other languages. So when, going right back to baby signing and Joseph Garcia, they found that when children have more than one language, and this includes, us as adults, with signing being one of them, they typically do better in all of them. And so signing becomes the bridge. So you want to learn Polish and you've got English and sign language. The sign connects them. The sign, and so it makes English as an additional language much easier. It's brilliant for SEND, but the BSL GCSE I think is a phenomenal achievement by everybody involved. And it has so much scope for the future for, as I say, for language acquisition and for job prospects, and just opening up the world to a whole raft of people who have been unable to access a language qualification in the past.
Yeah, I agree. I was so excited when I saw that it was available. Are there any resources that you would recommend? Any online resources or apps or courses or anything that you would recommend for anyone wanting to learn British Sign Language?
So with British Sign Language, if you can, I would always recommend that you learn with someone who is a deaf tutor, if at all possible. It's their primary language. And I think that's really important to support the deaf community, and so that you understand about their culture as well, and why it's important to them. There are native learners as well who aren't necessarily deaf, but who have learned use signing their whole life. Now, there aren't necessarily enough deaf people teaching sign language, and this is where some of the difficulty in accessing sign language that the National Deaf Children's Society found. All these people want to learn, but most people don't get the chance because the courses aren't on. You can learn at your local college. They sometimes have courses, but post-pandemic, there's lots of online courses now more freely available. If you're learning with little children, then I actually produce myself some lovely dual language, sign language storybooks, which are aimed at under sevens. And they were inspired by my daughter. And they include British Sign Language and English. And we've worked really, really hard on those. And the fifth of those books is coming out this autumn. So that's a really nice way to pick up sign language. And these books are absolutely loved by children of all ages. And I think certainly when we're talking about parents, so one of the startling facts is that 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. And so these parents are thrown into a world where they've got no knowledge of signing, of sign language, of how to use it. It's all brand new. It's very intense. And so supporting everybody within the family to normalise signing is what my lovely books do. They're for everybody. So grandma and grandpa can come over and have that lovely experience of reading with their little, granddaughter or grandson, and not miss out on those bonding experiences, which are so important and part of family life. So those kinds of things as well. But I really would recommend that where possible, please go to the deaf community, local deaf club. They are delighted to help people learn generally. They want inclusion and belonging in the same way that everybody else does. Failing that, obviously, then, there are lots of courses from people like Signature, and they are accredited courses with BSL that can take you through the BSL levels. And you never know, you might be so inspired you go on to interpreter level yourself, which is a remarkable achievement.
And where can everyone who's listening find your books? And do you have social media or website or anything that our listeners can have a look at the things that you produce?
Yes, so you can find me over at littlesignersclub.co.uk. And I'm mostly on Facebook, which is facebook.com/Little Signers Club.
Little Signers.
Yeah.
And what are your books? What are your books that you've written? What are they called?
So I have 4 at the moment. We have Our Farmyard Friends, which is a lovely story about a farmer and her animals. And At the Bottom of My Garden, which is all about mini beasts and an adventure through the bottom of the garden, which is absolutely gorgeous. And Out of My Window, which is a transport / things that go adventure. And then Animal ABC, which is the alphabet, and that has both left-handed and right-handed graphics in it, mainly because little children are ambidextrous, but not everybody, obviously, has the same dominant hand. So they're beautiful books. They've been really thought about very hard. As I say, they were inspired by my daughter originally. And then in September this year, we release The Leaves on the Trees, which is all about autumn.
And Shelley is doing a giveaway of some of her books. So if anybody would like a free copy of Shelley's book, then do post a comment below the podcast and I will take everybody's names and I will draw a couple of names out of a hat. And then Shelley will be able to post off a copy of one of her books to you. So that would be rather lovely. What a great way to start learning how to sign. So if anyone would like a copy of Shelley's books, then just put a comment below and I will get in touch and I will pull some names out of a hat and see what we get. Thank you so much, Shelley, for coming on the podcast today and guiding us through those things, because I really knew nothing about auditory processing disorder. And as I say, apart from my brief foray into British Sign Language when I was a teenager, again, that's something that slightly passed me by, and I can't wait to get back to doing it this summer. So thank you so much for coming on and inspiring our listeners.
That's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope your foray into relearning sign language this summer goes well.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.